Hello, everyone. I'm Steve Hirschhorn, and today's Gallery Teachers Masterclass is all about mentoring new teachers. In April of 1981, age 31, after having two previous careers, I was a newly qualified teacher graduating in the top 11%. Now, I'm not boasting, it's simply the fact. And as such, I thought I was ready for the big wide world of teaching. I knew it all. I mean, what more could there be? I've been trained by Adrian Underhill and his colleagues, many of whom were and still are well known in the industry. I had successfully managed classes at several levels while being critically observed by some eagle-eyed and sometimes ferocious trainers, as well, of course, as my fellow trainees. I had my TTT under control. I knew how to elicit. I knew how to correct errors of pronunciation. I knew how to correct grammar errors. And I knew how to present new language in the PPP model, which was prevalent in those days, and I believe still is in some initial teacher training courses. But also we were introduced to other approaches. I knew how to set up pairs or group work. I knew how to exploit materials, but I knew how to create my own too, which is perhaps even more important. I knew more about my own language. So when I started the process, I knew what a gerund was, and it wasn't a flower. I even knew a bit about using the Cuisenaire rods. So let me at them. The trouble was, I didn't know what I didn't know, if you see what I mean. Hasn't that got a name? I was immediately employed by International House Hastings, which now unfortunately is no more. I'd been trained there and they employed me straight away. And I found myself immersed in a world of extraordinary talent and knowledge. You might say I had 25 mentors, since all those teachers were more than happy to share their ideas with me, the newbie. The staff room was a place of fabulous creativity and generational ideas. And I still recall having a coffee there in the breaks between classes and discussing various aspects of what I was doing and what others were doing. It was an inspirational time and quite literally set me up for my career as a teacher trainer, and later a lecturer in linguistics. Soon after, I decided to travel and took a job in an IH school, International House School, in a European country. Once there, I asked the Irish owner if it would be okay if I used the rods in class. He responded, sure, but how do you carry them around? It turned out that he'd never come across the Cuisenaire rods, and imagined something like a fishing rods that you'd carry over your shoulder or something like that. Only a few weeks later, having observed me teaching using the rods, I found him in a corridor using the rods with a private student, a one-to-one student he had. Perhaps then I was mentoring him. I was certainly not mentored in that period. In fact, found that the teachers, other than three of us new teachers, were all part-timers who were teaching as a sideline and a sort of lifestyle choice rather than anything serious. There was a director of studies, a DOS, but he, while a nice chap, wasn't much use as a teacher guide. So you see, I don't have much experience as a mentee, which brings me to suggest that mentoring should be part of every new teacher's PD program, the professional development program. And I do now have considerable experience as a mentor, working with new teachers in a variety of contexts. I've recently been conducting a small-scale survey in my own Facebook group called ELT Haven to determine whether or not teachers received mentoring. Apparently some did, but an insignificant minority, which I feel is a shame and a waste of resources, since mentoring benefits not only the receiver, but also the giver. Let's have a look, first of all, at what mentoring means. We start with the notion that a mentor is a teacher with a long and varied experience, a senior in the field, but not necessarily a director of studies. Indeed, hopefully someone who's in the classroom more than the office, because it's very easy to be wise when you're not being tested in the real world. A mentor is someone who understands how the process of teaching and learning works in the context of the place in which they work. Now, I make this to guide us away from the notion that a mentor needs to be highly qualified in applied linguistics, for example. I would prefer to examine the character or personality of the mentor rather than their CV. The reason for this possibly odd criterion is that a mentor will need to understand that they have huge power to make or break a new teacher with a few words. That's true, isn't it? A possibly vulnerable new teacher lacking in professional confidence who is still finding their way and managing diverse, tricky classes in a new environment may be easily affected adversely by a throwaway comment from an insensitive senior. So we assume a teacher who is recently qualified in a recognized teacher program, validated either by an exam board in the case of Trinity College London or CELTA, or run by a government-led institution in the case of state school teachers around the world. Or perhaps a teacher who's long qualified with some experience, but is new to the institution. Now we know, don't we, that all those initial teacher training courses vary enormously in their degree of efficacy and indeed in the quality of the instruction, notwithstanding the efforts of the exam boards to standardize. The result of that is a huge difference in the quality of new teachers entering the profession. In some areas of the world, a PhD is needed to enter the profession, an absurd example of overqualification, if I may say so. Elsewhere, a 4 or 5 week CELTA is or an equivalent is perfectly acceptable because those short courses focus mainly on the practicalities of life in the classroom, or these days, of course, behind a screen. Later, after the course, one learns on the job, as it were. And that, of course, is what we're talking about today. Mentoring, therefore, has to respond to the individual needs of each teacher, whatever their professional qualifications or previous experience. There's really no point talking about the subtleties of body language or voice tone with a new teacher who's been trained to sit behind a desk and deliver a lecture on the grammar of English with that dreaded declarative focus on structure, but has never been introduced to the dynamics of a communicative, lexical, or task-based approach. So that's our starting point. Mentoring means responding to the needs of each teacher. What a surprise that mentoring has the same starting point as teaching. But how do you know where your new mentee is? How do you know, what they don't know, and what they need to know? This can't be a one-size-fits-all job. So somehow we need to assess where this new teacher sits on the continuum from beginner to expert. A good place to start is to ask, what do you need? You know, it's a funny thing, if I just might digress for a moment, but I've found so many similarities between my life as a language person and my previous life, actually, as a motorcyclist. I used to ride big touring bikes. And for a while, I was a coach for an advanced riding group in the UK. To become a coach, I had to be examined. And the first question my mentor asked, even before observing me ride, was, "What are you good at?" I responded, "My lines are good," meaning, for the non-motorcyclist here, my positioning on the road was good. Then we went out and he followed me, taking mental notes. When we finally stopped, he told me my biggest problem was in positioning. The very area I thought I had strength turned out to be my greatest weakness. So my point here is that in asking someone what they need, or indeed what they're good at, we get a door ajar to peer through, even if their answers are not accurate, or perhaps especially so. On that basis, my first tip or indicator would be to certainly ask what your mentor needs or wants, but then to keep a very open mind so that you're not constricted by their own self-perception. Our view of ourselves is so often colored by parents, teachers, peers, and so on. As a rule, we don't see ourselves as others do and may easily believe the opposite of that which is true. Try asking someone if they know how to sing. Can you sing? Most people smile or laugh and say no. And then you ask them who told them that. It turns out it was a teacher. We have so much power, much more than we realize. We can influence a person for life with a few words. Who was it who said that a teacher is more dangerous than a surgeon, as a teacher can cut more than one person at a time? So we're personalizing our mentor course. The next thing to do is to try to make the mentorship as mentee-driven as possible. This means getting the mentee to decide how much of your time they would like, and also to make other decisions about the form of the mentoring. Put the ball in their court. They make the decisions. Here's a little trick, if you will, which I've also used with students and others over the year. You say, would you like to do this or that? Or you say, would you like to do this now or later? So you're asking if they want to do X or Y, not D. And then you're asking if they want to do X now or later, not if they want to do it at all. This is manipulative, there's no denying that, but it has a positive outcome. And often it frees people up from having to decide if they want to do X at all. You can decide if you think you're okay to use that that level of soft manipulation, bearing in mind that every time we open our mouths, we're manipulating people to some degree. So I'm quite happy to ask, would you like 2 hours a week of meetings with me, or 3 to start with? Since if I ask how much time in meetings with me would you like to start with, the answer could be quite absurd. They might say an hour a day, or they might say 15 minutes a week. This is a simple example of how you can lead your mentee, and also students as a byproduct, towards a level of apparent self-determination while still keeping hold of the new reins, as it were. Likewise, when discussing the essential nature of observation, are you happy that I come in for the first lesson on Tuesday, or would you prefer the second? Is a way of avoiding a potential conflict. The fact that you're going in, the question is only when. Notice too that I'm suggesting they will be happy or prefer me to come in. This technique of choice giving, the double bind as I call it, is a powerful and useful device against which people almost never object, they never rail against it. It comes originally from the hypnotic induction techniques of therapist Milton Erickson, one of my heroes or gurus. I never met him. Another of his techniques was to say, I don't know how quickly you're going to become a great teacher, or I don't know how fast you're going to become a great teacher, but our sessions will be designed to help that process. Now here, the first clause is the all-important part. I don't know how fast, how quickly, how rapidly X is going to happen. The implication here is that you will become a great teacher. The question is only how fast or when. Now, Erickson used this to get his clients to move towards their goal, whatever that was. Of course, you don't need these techniques to be a mentor, but I found them useful, used carefully and sparingly. Approach almost everything you do with the mentee with choices. especially if they're lacking in confidence or perhaps even antagonistic towards the idea of being mentored. I've met people just off the CELTA in their first job who think they don't need anyone to guide them. Does that remind you of anyone here present? These people are considerably in need of help and guidance since they don't know what they don't know. Isn't it the Dunning-Kruger effect or something? It's not arrogant, or maybe it is a bit, but I prefer to think of it as confidence, and confidence is quite handy in a teacher. Not to be battered or diminished, but to be guided. It's tempting to some mentors to show how much they know by swamping their mentees with massive amounts of information. This, by the way, is also true of some teacher trainers who want to show how very clever and extremely knowledgeable they are. Resist this. They just come across as idiots. As I say, I realize that it's also true of some teachers taking pleasure, pride even, in demonstrating how much they know by drowning their students in unnecessary and possibly completely irrelevant information. I was told once by somebody, never answer a question you haven't been asked. And there are educators who could benefit from that piece of advice. That's assuming, of course, that you have a context in which students or your mentee or whoever it is, your interlocutor, is encouraged to ask questions. Many years ago, I observed a teacher teaching with Suggestopeda, and over a few days, she lost most of her student group. They all had plausible excuses for dropping out, but it was clear to me that the teacher was overloading them with her own personal knowledge. She was showing how clever she was to the detriment of her learners. They voted with their feet, and they were right to do so. So what are the practical aspects of mentoring, I hear you ask, as I ramble my way through this? New teachers or teachers who are approaching a new challenge need practical and perhaps theoretical help and support as they navigate the waters. They need to be able to discuss what they're doing with someone who will listen and knows how to respond. Yeah, you need to be a good listener to be an effective mentor, but you do to be a good teacher, don't you? People often think they're good listeners, but in fact are not. Check yourself out. Are you actually listening? Or are you waiting for a break to get your own point across? You need to be a good listener to be an effective mentor. People often think they're good listeners, but in fact, they're not. Check yourself out. Are you actually listening or waiting for a break to get your own point across? You need to be able to encourage your mentee to talk about what they're doing in detail while you listen carefully, showing genuine interest. This means you have to have the right questions ready. How did that go? Not a bad place to start. But now and again, you'll need to interject a more specifically aimed question to encourage some in-depth consideration, some in-depth thinking. These questions are similar to that which a good therapist might use, designed to open the discussion up and cause your interlocutor to consider. Why do you think that happened? When did you feel you'd caught the group? What could have been another way to do that? Why did that go so well? So you see, I'm suggesting a variety of questions which focus on specific moments in a class or in the development of the teacher, not just the negative. And you'll notice that all of these require more than a yes-no answer. It's easy to focus on the negative, isn't it? But it's much harder to notice the things which are going well and explore why that is. I don't think it's the mentor's job to intervene and pronounce. Again, rather like a decent therapist, guiding towards discovery rather than telling people what to do. And that, of course, means that the mentee is the one who works it all out, not the mentor. This brings its own sense of accomplishment and pride. There may be times when you'll need to offer clear advice and guidance, but more often than not, The right questions will get your mentee where they need to be. Sometimes you'll need to focus on specifics, some aspect of the teaching which is going extremely well or is in need of some redirection. I found asking if a mentee might be interested in running a short workshop for colleagues on a specific technique is a great way of instilling joy and providing feedback without actually giving it. Would you care to share your ideas about eliciting with the other teachers? Not only does this boost and foster confidence, but it also causes the mentee to consider in depth what they're doing and how they're doing it. Of course, it also helps to create bonds within the teacher group as a collateral effect. Another little ruse I have used is to relate an anecdote, such as, I was just telling someone the other day, I said, you can learn to get students to speak much more if you take a step back. But I was just telling someone the other day, and then you give the piece of information that you'd like to deliver. It's a nice way of giving someone some advice without directly telling them. And usually it elicits some questions or clarifications. What did they say? How did that go? What was the result of that? And so on. So you've opened another door in a way. Now, if you have an experienced mentee, check out how their previous teaching has been going, the kinds of classes they were used to, the age, level, and also length. If a teacher has been used to teaching 40-minute lessons and your school runs 90, then it's worth discussing how those timings break down in a typical class. Likewise, if they've never taught beginners or a C1 level or an exam class, some support will be needed. Whether or not a new teacher should be giving exam classes is moot. Let's assume that they've been asked to do so. What advice would you give to someone who's new to teaching young learners, high levels, or preparing a group for an exam? You can argue that whole courses are given over to training teachers to do these things, but you don't have the luxury, so you'll need to consider short, accessible pieces of advice which are pertinent and useful. It's true that going to the expert is not always the best place to go, not always the best place to clarify or resolve a problem. It can happen that the expert, from their lofty position, fails to understand where the novice is when they start their journey. I recently asked a question in a teacher's group to stimulate some discussion. A teacher with lots of experience and quite well known commented that the answer was obvious and that such a question had no place in that group. And yet I know that this teacher sees himself as a general mentor. He wasn't able to drop down to a non-expert level. Bear this in mind. I have in the past placed my mentee with another relatively new teacher to discuss the procedures and processes involved with teaching specific kinds of groups. It's a kind of buddy system. I have found this works extremely well since the not-so-new teacher can recall a journey and has recent experience to impart. They'll feel valued in being asked to share. The mentee gains information from a colleague and will discuss it with you, the mentor. That's you're on the same page. Experts, on the other hand, can tend to assume too much, can offer too much advice, can miss out important details, which for them are so obvious because it's automatic behavior for some people. It's not always the case, but it's worth bearing in mind. Avoid, this is really easy. This is used so often. It's supposed to encourage, but actually it doesn't encourage at all. I play music and I often find that someone we're learning a new piece and someone says, this is really easy. It is if you know it, but it's not easy if you don't. So simply avoid that kind of unhelpful value judgment, even if it's supposed to be helpful. Not easy or difficult, it simply is. Now, on a basic but essential level, make sure that the teacher, your mentee, knows their timetable and where their classes are held, as well as level and what materials are being used. They shouldn't be anxious about knowing where and when they're teaching. And in fact, sometimes in the case of an extensive campus, it might even be desirable to provide a map of the institution with classrooms and break rooms marked. In preparing a new teacher or a teacher new to the school, it can seem reasonable to offer guidance as to the students and their performance. Beware. Beware, but be careful of giving warnings unless absolutely necessary. Telling a new teacher that class X is extremely difficult or are slow or have some disruptive characters may seem like a good idea, but it'll program the teacher and their expectations may well have a negative effect. The fact is that given a class or student might have been difficult for a particular teacher, it doesn't mean that they are for everybody. You don't know. What works for one teacher might not work for another. It might be an attitude problem, might be a clash of personalities. Who knows? But after a class or two, you can probe a little, but still not influencing the teacher to believe anything more than what they themselves discovered. Another of my gurus, Caleb Gitenia, when told that a participant in one of his workshops was expecting something else, he said, leave your expectations outside the door. Leave your expectations outside the door. This is one of the most useful pieces of advice I've ever come across, both in professional terms and in personal terms too. So pre-influencing in either a positive way, this group is brilliant, or in a negative way, this group is disruptive, is actually counterproductive. Let them discover for themselves. If it happens, and it can, the new teacher reports exactly what a previous teacher had noted, then you can offer help and advice. But I still wouldn't pass on that previous teacher's experience. On the other hand, if, as happened to me, there is a deaf person, for example, in the class, then this is no longer an opinion, but a fact. And knowing about it in advance will help the teacher prepare and work on some strategies. It would have been good to know that the gentleman of around 65 in a class I took on as a new teacher with no mentor was almost entirely deaf, not hard of hearing. And had I been told, I could have worked sooner on some IPA, silent pronunciation, and other areas. As it was, I had to teach 2 classes before I realized that he was trying to lip read, and his production was odd due to the fact that he could hear nothing. My point is that when facts exist, a student is otherwise able, is colorblind, is ill, needs certain medication during class and so on, then you would be remiss not to point that out, but also to offer support and advice as to how these things might be managed. Now, your mentee might be young and starting out in his or her first career, but equally, as I've noticed in other masterclasses here, they might already have experienced life in other contexts. You'll need to judge this based on what you know about the teacher. I mean, if they've worked as a social worker or a therapist, for example, it might be safe to assume that they're used to dealing with people. But it might also be worth bearing in mind that we're not paid nor required to offer any form of therapy to our students, and indeed should not, however tempting it might be to apply previously learned skills. Now, the techniques that I mentioned earlier may be therapeutic in origin, but they're not therapeutic in application or in practice as far as we're concerned. I've met teachers with a social care employment history who see every slightly abnormal behavior as an aberration and have tried to intervene therapeutically. This is not right and must not happen. it's not our job. And in the case when something goes wrong, it will be the student who suffers, of course, but the organization could also find itself in trouble, as could the teacher. It's always best to explain to teachers, both new and experienced, that if any behavior in class needs some sort of professional help, then they should report that to the director of studies, their mentor, or at the very least, the senior teacher, and do so in writing. There is a record. I was devastated when a trainee teacher on the very first initial teacher training course I directed committed suicide in week 2. I spent days and nights wondering if it was something I'd done or not done, but in the end, the police established that there were personal circumstances which we couldn't have known about. Well, since then, my antennae have been alert for any sort of cry for help behavior, and on spotting anything, I've always written it down and passed it to my superiors. Another area to consider is that of location and social contexts. It's possible that your mentee may have moved away from familiar territory, perhaps another country, to work with your organization. And in that case, in order to ensure that the work goes smoothly and efficiently, it's worth considering what you do to support and acclimatize the new teacher. I would suggest asking, for example, if they've discovered the Saturday market, or the bar which serves the best cocktails, or the cinema which shows films in original language, and so on. If your staff holds regular social events, maybe a pizza at the end of the working week, then be sure to make an open invitation to the new kid on the block. If there are sights to see, you might even suggest the local bus or train and point out any pitfalls or procedures when buying tickets. It might even be worth preparing a document specifically for new teachers with useful, fun, and interesting information. So something which all teachers can contribute to. Remember, too, that your mentee may be functioning in a language they don't know. Perhaps you can point them in the direction of a good language teacher or some online apps. There are so many these days, which will help to give them some confidence in that new language. All these ideas are designed to put your new staff member at ease so they can focus better on the work. So you're not wasting time doing this. It's actually an investment. Consider any social norms in the area where you work. Your mentee may not know that in some parts of the world, showing the soles of your feet can be considered rude. Likewise, there are gestures such as a thumbs up, which in some places are either not known or considered an insult. I recall meeting an American in Europe who had a thing going with the local concrete magnate's daughter, a wealthy man, and they were supposed to meet in a bar, and she didn't show up. The American got on the phone and asked where Maria was, but in an extremely inappropriate way, because that was the coarse language he'd heard people using on the street. Maria never appeared. So understanding the local mores will help your mentee acclimatize and fit in. This will have a positive effect on students. Everything you and your colleagues do to assist a new member of staff will pay off in the end, whether that is a direct professional mentoring or inviting them for a drink. As teachers, we already work in an isolated environment in terms of professional contact. If you think about it, doctors, nurses, police officers work in teams or groups. But we meet up in the breaks while we're doing our job. We're isolated unless being observed. And even then, we're not in a team. Of course, students are there too, but we're still isolated because we're the professional, we're the, if you like, the experts. Because of that isolation, it's very easy to kid ourselves that we know what we're doing, getting it all right, as I previously noted. Part of the mentor's job then is to try to encourage the mentee to critically review what they're doing, admit that which could be improved, but also celebrate that which is truly going well. In the final analysis, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, as they say. If students are progressing, if teachers are content, challenged, but also coping well and enjoying the work, then you and they have all done your jobs. So let's have a look at what we've got so far. Our conclusions. Every new teacher should have a competent mentor because they deserve that. And such a process will make everything easier and more effective in the end. A mentor is a practical role, perhaps with some theoretical underpinning to pull out of the bag when necessary. Focus on the classroom, referring to the research only when it will have a direct impact on performance. Discover the needs of the new teacher. Don't assume we're all different and your mentee's background will be unique. Optionally, use the double bind question format. Use an efficient question format. It takes the pressure off both you and your mentee while providing them with a route. Keep information minimal and pertinent. Overload is extremely negative and will damage the rapport you have with your mentee. Ask specific questions to focus on classroom processes, stimulate thought and in-depth consideration of what happened and what could happen. Ensure stress-free transitioning, geography, timetables, and hours. It's obvious, really, isn't it? Put yourself in your new teacher's shoes. What do you need to know? Avoid over-influencing, but do give actual factual information on students if really necessary. It can be helpful, but only if the teacher has a way to prepare. No drama, just cool, calm facts, not opinion. Keep in mind previous experience or previous work status, both from a positive and a negative point of view. How can this person's previous life be useful to them here? And how might we mitigate this person's previous experience? If it applied in the classroom, it wouldn't be helpful. I used to train new teachers who had been in the army or the military anyway. And it was sometimes tricky to get them to stop being a sergeant major, issuing orders to their students. Many of them managed very, very well in the end. Ensure that local mores and expectations are understood. Knowing about the context and having a chance to survive results in happier staff and eventually happier students. So from both an educational point of view and from a marketing point of view, these things are, I believe, all extremely valuable. So thank you very much for following. I hope it's been interesting and I hope it's also been useful.